Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Brave New World is supported by the Center for Data Science, or CDS, at NYU. If your organization is interested in engaging with CDS through student projects, please email cdsindustry@nyu.edu. For more color on the podcast and additional commentary, please subscribe to my newsletter at vasantdar.substack.com. Hello, and welcome to Brave New World. The internet is used in very different ways across the world. In the US, it's a relative free-for-all. In China, it's under state control. India is charting a different digital path, which began with its biometric authentication system in 2009. Since then, it's built on top of that success by creating, quote-unquote, a digital public infrastructure, which should be thought of as a digital network for delivering services to people. But how such infrastructure should be governed is far from obvious. Joining me today is Ajay Shah, who is critical of the role of the state in administrating such systems. Ajay is an economist who understands technology and regulation deeply and holds the view that India and many other developing countries lack the required public policy framework to administer such systems. This makes government-controlled digital infrastructure rife for misuse and at the risk of stagnation because it becomes walled off from the competitive pressures of market competition and innovation. There's always a lot to learn from deeply informed skeptics like Ajay. Ajay, welcome to Brave New World. Delighted to have you on the show.
Thanks, Vasant. I'm honored to be here with you. It's a great show.
So, Ajay, before we get started, just tell us a little bit about yourself. What's been your history and how did you become an economist and how did you get into doing the kinds of things you're doing now?
Okay. I studied engineering as an undergraduate and I was always in the worldview of economics, the old type of big ideas economics, not the modern technical kind, because my father was an economist. So he died when I was 17, but by that time I had a sense of that curiosity and that interest in the world and the grand drama of the 20th century. Basically, I got all that from him. And I went on to get a PhD in economics and I was in India. I've done many fields. I started out in the securities markets. I was part of the early building of NSE and SEBI. I worked in the field of pensions. I was part of the early construction of the new pension system. I was part of the early establishment of the goods and services tax, working with Vijay Kelkar and Arvind Modi. Then I gained knowledge of law. I was part of the Financial Sector Legislative Reforms Commission, which did fundamental thinking on the laws that shape finance. I was part of the drafting of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. So this gives you a flavor of my life at the intersection of economics, law, and public administration. And all through this, I have been a good computer geek. I have been booting Linux since kernel 0.1. It's been my main system. I am the author of open source software. I have been part of a great deal of cool technology in all the things that you have heard me. I was part of one of the world's first cheap parallel cluster that was put into work for doing risk management at the National Securities Clearing Corporation. So computer engineering.
I had no idea that you were such a nerd, Ajay.
Yeah,
I viewed you sort of as a hardcore economist, but
yeah. So along the way, I have all along been an excited part of the computer revolution. I've been writing R since 2001, and 2 years ago, I've started shifting all my work to Julia, and I try to know computer science. It's a great field. Amit Verma, our good friend, recently gave me zero notice, and in a high-speed conversation, he said to me, who was the greatest human being from the last 50 years? And basically, with zero notice, I had to come up with an answer on the spot. And the answer that jumped out of my tongue was Ken Thompson.
Wow. All right. Yeah, that you are revealing your sort of hardcore nerd slash engineering roots.
Yes.
Impressive, because I had no idea. I sort of viewed you as sort of a hardcore economist and someone who thinks about policy and law and stuff like that. So it's doubly impressive that you actually double as a nerd, and that you're writing stuff in Julia, and I assume working with Python notebooks and all that other kind of nerdy
Julia
stuff.
notebooks, Pluto notebooks.
All right, I stand corrected. So, are you binge watching anything these days? Are you watching sports? Any of that stuff? Oh, by the way, talking about sports, there's this amazing World Cup women's soccer going on. I don't know if you watched any of the games.
Actually,
Uh,
in sports, I had just been so happy that the Indian kids are getting somewhere in chess. So I think in the late 90s, for the first time, Vishwanathan Anand got to the candidates. And after that, there has never been an Indian there. And we are potentially at the brink of not one, but two Indians getting there. And it just is so amazing watching the great Mylapore explosion shaping up.
it's funny. I never really thought of chess as sports. In fact, just before we started chatting, I usually sort of try and get my head together before a podcast and sort of think of the major points. But I was completely distracted by this England Australia game going on, which is actually still going on at the moment. And I'm just amazed at the level of skill. And someone asked me, like, but why are you so surprised? I was like, I don't know. It's just like there's just been an explosion in terms of the level of skill. And I think money has something to do with it. The fact that these players are just getting paid a lot of money now, and you just sort of see this just explosion in
So I
quality.
think sports science has gotten better. The
Yeah,
combination of nutrition and training coupled with the application of modern science in a purposive way is delivering athletic gains of the kind that more informal methods of 30 years ago would
yeah.
not deliver.
True, true. Yeah. So there's a real acceleration in the sort of quality of play. Yeah, for sure. So Ajay, let's start talking about the subject du jour. I've been wanting to talk to you about, this whole area of digital public infrastructure in which there's a lot of interest globally, in terms of like, taking the internet to the next level, in its evolution. And it's not entirely clear what that's going to look like, but India's got a lot of attention. The Aadhaar system, the national authentication system that uses biometrics, that was rolled out in 2009, has got a lot of attention. I guess by and large, it's regarded as a big success. And, I've written about it as well, generally quite favorably. Since then, we've had sort of more stuff, being rolled out in India as part of this digital public infrastructure. But let's just sort of roll back to Aadhaar and, the original motivation there, and the way it's evolved, and how you view the whole space of, digital public infrastructure. So, take that from any angle, and let's go into some detail.
As an economist, I have been worried about language. I worry about the words public good and I worry about the words infrastructure. So I think there's a certain element of greenwashing that's going on. I think these are nice words. When anybody says public goods, how can you be against a public good? When you say public infrastructure, how can you be against public infrastructure? So I think these terms are chosen in a way to bludgeon uh, the opponents into agreement. And I worry about precise definitions. Public good is something that is non-rival and non-excludable. So source code sitting on a website that can be downloaded by anybody is a public good. Many other things in this space are not. So I would like to be careful around the application of these words. Similarly, anything that could conceivably be done reasonably well by a competitive industry does not need to be government owned. I just treat that as a fundamental principle of economics, that a competitive private sector works great. And when we see government monopolies being constructed, it makes me nervous. And I'd probably be uncomfortable anywhere in the world, but I would particularly be uncomfortable in a country like India where the government works poorly. So the same state power leads to less good outcomes under Indian conditions. So there are shades of gray that we should apply in many of the systems that have been done in India, and they each merit careful examination and a little bit of this first principles. Is it non-rival? Is it non-excludable, and so on? So, just speaking for me right at the outset, when the ideas of biometric ID first came up, I want to shout out to Robert Palacios of the World Bank, who was the first person working with his Ukrainian friend Alexei. They were the first people to come up with the idea. Then Nandan Nilekani made the idea famous and prominent in his first book. There's a masterly chapter that really persuaded people that this was a game changer for the purpose of running welfare programs. And I was very excited and very comfortable at the time. It has turned into something less attractive. It's become a mandatory biometric digital ID for everybody in the country. So instead of the electronification of welfare programs, it has turned into a broader citizen identity system, which is more concerning. I'm generally puzzled at the fact that most advanced democracies don't do biometric systems. In the UK, there was a great debate around whether identity should be biometric or not. And in the end, the answer was no, you should not do it. Similarly, in the United States, there would not be biometrics. Fingerprinting is done for people with a police record. It's not done for everybody. Things like that. So I think there are many civil liberties concerns around universal biometric ID systems. So there has been a certain mission creep around the Aadhaar system that makes me nervous. And as I said,
so just let's go back to sort of, I guess, the roots of your concern, right? Where you say the language chosen to describe these things, like public good, you're sort of, and you use the word sort of bludgeoned into sort of thinking about it in a certain way. To be fair, markets tend to ignore certain things as well, right? I mean, one of my earlier guests, this reminds me of a conversation with Albert Wenger, who said, markets don't address things that can't be priced. And I guess in a country like India, sort of inclusion is something that really can't be priced, right? So isn't that something where markets would probably have not taken care of that and were failing to sort of address this problem of inclusion that required some sort of authority to sort of take charge and say, look, and the markets are not going to address this. This is a public problem and it needs some sort of state involvement to sort of get going, right? Wasn't that the original sort of motivation, which seemed to be a good one, right?
So I'm a hardcore finance person. I'm very happy to talk about financial inclusion. It's a subject very close to my heart, and I will in a moment. But I just want to show the sequence of events that originally the UID AI system was sold for government welfare programs. And most of us would agree that better engineering of government welfare programs is a noble cause. And I just want to say that there was a mission creep when it turned into a universal system to track everybody. And we should worry about the nature of the political economy through which those kinds of pivots happened. Okay, let's turn to financial inclusion. So let me start from a different problem. That different problem is telephones. There was a time in India when telephones were few and far between, and the dream of policymakers was that there should be a phone booth in every village so that you could put in a 50 paisa coin and make a call. Okay, that was considered a dream of the early days, and it was called a village telephone scheme. And I've actually studied these things in the 90s. Okay, and that was a time when there were these government monopolies. So the Department of Telecom ran some government-owned companies. There was the MTNL, which had a monopoly on running a telephone system in the big cities. And there was BSNL, which had a monopoly on all telephone services everywhere else. And there was the VSNL, which had a monopoly on international telecom. Okay, so that was a nice socialistic way of thinking, that it was felt telecom is too important to be left to the private sector. And you need public action, you need purposive public action. And there was a state monopoly created called the BSNL, which was given the mandate to please go forth and build one payphone in every village of India. And they spent decades and it didn't get done, and it never got done. Okay, and then came a technological revolution and an economic revolution. The economic revolution was competition, that there were multiple private foreign telephone companies who came into the country, and they brought private sector competence, they brought hunger, they brought efficiency. And alongside that, they came on the wings of the technological revolution. So you had better technology, you had fiber optics, we had mobile telephony and all that. And today in India, basically, everybody has a phone. So that to me is the metaphor around which we should think about financial inclusion. What we have in India is a financial economic policy system which is designed for complete state control. There are public sector banks, there are some private sector banks, there are some other financial firms, but every single product, every single process in the working of Indian finance is controlled by the government. In many, many areas, there is very little competition. And there is that stagnation that you see in every
So
area.
let me just interrupt you here, Ajay, just for a second. So when you say it's a government thing, so you're saying that the Reserve Bank, you're for all practical purposes treating it as just another arm of the government.
Yeah, it is.
Sort of similar
And
to how the Federal Reserve is, but the Federal Reserve is in the US is presumably independent in some ways. It's part of the government, but it's sort of an independent body. And I think you're implying that the Reserve Bank has less of independence in some way
so first,
of
just for
India.
clarity, there are actually multiple financial regulators. But second, and I'm referring to all of them. I'm referring to the joint work of the government and all these financial regulators put together. But what I'm referring to has nothing to do with independence. It is socialism. The problem is not that the union government gives instructions to the Reserve Bank of India and it prevents the Reserve Bank of India from doing more reformist things. If anything, it's the other way around. So there is an entire philosophy of control which pervades the Indian state. And every product, every process is controlled by the government. There are a large amount of anti-competitive barriers that have been strung up everywhere. There are barriers against becoming a new bank. There are barriers against a non-bank that might try to compete with a bank, and so on. There is just a lack of competition everywhere. There is that silence, the stagnation that comes out of government control, out of a central planning system, where in one sentence, every product, every process is controlled by the government. There is almost negligible competition because any change that anybody wants to make to any product or process, first, you have to go take permission of the government. Details of products and processes are written into regulations. So really all the apparent financial firms, whether they are a public sector firm or a private sector firm, are really a department of the government. They're all obeying and getting instructions from the government. It's also a non-rule of law environment where the government, again, I refer to the government as this overall combination. The government can be very unpleasant to firms or to individuals. So nobody stands up to question or challenge the government. In this environment, financial inclusion has been a failure. So you get amazing innovations like you may have seen at every pawn shop in India. You get innovations like selling 10 rupees and 20 rupees of mobile phone refills so that poor people are able to buy a little bit of mobile telephony at a very small ticket size. There's all kinds of innovation that took place in telecom because of the combination of a more open regulatory environment and private and foreign firms bracket riding the wings of Moore's law. None of that has happened in India in finance. And that is why we do not have financial inclusion. So I don't share a technological solutionist view of Indian finance. I am deeply a finance person from 1993 till 2023, while I have also written lots of fun code and open source and all that. I've actually done finance all through. And I am not convinced that the root cause analysis of the difficulties of financial inclusion takes you to some limitations about the working of the market or of the technological possibilities as the solution. The root cause analysis is bad regulations, low levels of competition, entry barriers against private firms, entry barriers against foreign firms. We have created the silence of a graveyard in Indian finance where private people don't think, don't innovate, don't compete. Every single change, you have to first go get it approved by the government. So, yeah, it doesn't surprise me that Indian finance fails the Indian economy, but that's a bigger
Yeah,
problem.
Ajay, like, what you're saying is like so much at odds with sort of what we hear, right, in the media. And, I mean, and I've certainly, I guess, drunk the Kool-Aid to some extent. We had Modi address sort of the, US lawmakers and talk about all of this great digital stuff going on in India, right? And yet, you're sounding pretty pessimistic. You're saying that it's, the original intentions were noble, but you've had this sort of coercion creep in gradually. So say more about this. Like, I get the point that, technology in and of itself is not the solution to social problems. It's got to be accompanied by sort of a lot of cladding around it, a lot of process. And I think you're pointing to maybe sort of the lack of process and sort of a weak capability of the state. So let's sort of talk a little bit about that. But before we do that, just give some examples of like what you see as being sort of this increase in coercion that's happened, since the introduction of Aadhaar almost 15 years ago. Like how has India become sort of a more coercive state because of technology?
There are a couple of ways to think about it. The first, so around Aadhaar, I never had an intention of getting an Aadhaar number. My worldview is I will never claim welfare benefits from the government. So I don't need a biometric ID. I should be a free person. I should never have to submit my fingerprint and iris image to the government. But one by one, the Aadhaar system was made mandatory for many things. And you started getting harassed with text messages saying you can't have a bank account if you don't have an Aadhaar number. Many, many things just started breaking down because the Aadhaar number was mandatory. So, speaking for me, I was coerced into getting an Aadhaar number. I had no intention of ever letting the Indian state get to my biometrics, but that's how that coercion was done. In the case of UPI, it is a system which was really built using large inputs of state coercion. Uh, Private and foreign people were prohibited and blocked from innovating in the payment system. And then UPI was the national champion. So there was only one
So,
game in town.
Ajay, just for the sort of global listeners who don't know about UPI, just step back a little bit and just tell us a little bit about what UPI is all about, in a nutshell.
Sure. UPI is like PayPal. Each person gets a symbolic address. So in PayPal, you would get an address Vasant at PayPal. And a merchant could do two-way transactions using that logical address. And then there would be a plumbing underneath through which the transactions would be implemented. But it cut across diverse mechanisms inside the financial system. And it was a simple address. So it was basically like sending an email. Email is governed around an RFC 822. And you don't need to know the underlying implementation about which vendor, which provider transports those bits, but the email will get through. In similar fashion, PayPal will get through. So UPI is basically a PayPal for India, where people get that logical address. I seem to think I am Ajay and Shah -1 at OK Access. Okay, Access is my bank. And so everybody gets that kind of PayPal-like address, and then we're able to move money from one to another. So that's UPI. Now, underneath this user interface, there is an implementation layer. The way it works is that there is a single company, the name is NPCI, which is controlled by the government, which does the processing work of taking in all these transactions and connecting them up to underlying payment instructions in the banking system. So that's UPI. That UPI is a person-to-person payment mechanism based on logical addresses, and it works cutting across banks. So that's the description of the UPI system.
Okay, so continue, right? So you were talking about
Yeah, so
UPI.
there was a large dose of coercion that went into establishing the UPI system. Private and foreign persons were prohibited from playing in this business. So there was only one game in town, and this was the national champion. I want to describe one story in particular. PayPal, it turns out, was in India and has been reasonably successful in enabling Indian companies to build a website, sell their wares, and get paid through PayPal. So there is money flowing into an Indian company that is transported from overseas into their account using PayPal. So there, the simple global PayPal system works. And I believe at some point, PayPal went to the Reserve Bank of India and sought permission to run PayPal domestically within India. Okay, and I believe that permission was not granted. So private and foreign innovation was blocked in India. Vodafone's M-Pesa system was successful in Kenya, but it was not permitted to be launched in India. And there was a national champion, that was the UPI, that was built in India. And as an economist, I worry about all these things. I worry about the creation of monopolies. I worry about government control. These are unhealthy ways in which you build these systems. So, yeah, when you have a single standard and lots of people work to a standard, it seems nice. So, to an engineer's minds, to the mind of an engineer, standards wars are seen as messy. They're seen as a waste. To an economist, wars in the competitive space are the source of efficiency. That if you are not waging wars in market after market after market, there is something unhealthy about the economic system. So I do not yearn for a clean world in which a government mandates technology.
And yet you have like something like GPS, right, which is a public good, has like facilitated all kinds of innovation, worth trillions of dollars.
Card, card carrying economist, GPS is a public good. It is non rival. My consumption of GPS in no way diminishes your access to GPS. In fact, the satellites don't listen to us, they only shout. They're a broadcast system, they're a lighthouse. Okay. And second, it's non excludable. As long as those satellites are not switched off, there is no way to target you or me and switch us off the system. So Samuelson's definition of a public good applies to GPS. It does not apply to any of these other systems. So I just want to be picky about jargon. That
Okay, so you're saying that UPI is not a public good because it's not
it's a
non-rival and
single
non-economic.
corporation. It's very
Yeah.
much rival. It's very much excludable. Famously, there was a period where WhatsApp was cut off from being a part of the UPI system. You could not do payments on WhatsApp using UPI. Non-banks have been blocked from doing a variety of things through the UPI system. Everybody's told you must go through a bank. So UPI is very much a part of an industrial policy, control of an industrial system where banks are preferred, foreigners are unpreferred, or it's the discretion of the government. We don't like WhatsApp for whatever reason, so we'll prevent WhatsApp. Or the government decided at one point that the market share of Google shall be capped at 33%. So Mr. Google was supposed to stop accepting customers so that their market share would not cross 33%. So this is very much rival and excludable. It's not a public good. There is no open source in UPI. There are no open standards in UPI. There is no RFC process. There is no IETF. It's a national champion.
So, Ajay, I guess I'll let you beat up on UPI some more. In our private conversation, you described it as sort of a science project, and and I thought about it, and I wondered whether it's a good science project, right? Because it's touted as being successful, right? 15 countries apparently are either in the process of adopting it or considering adopting it, right? So something must have been done right in the design of the protocols that sort of power it. So why do you describe it as a sort of bad, or rather as a science project, and maybe a poor one at that?
Yeah, so there are two distinct issues. One is about countries and adoption. These days, state power is the grand problem of the universe today. And I can see how many governments would like to amass more state power. So it doesn't surprise me that these government-run systems are popular with many kinds of governments. And I can see why many a country would want a biometric identity system through which they can keep track of and control all their citizens. That's not necessarily a net positive for the universe. Speaking as a finance person, however, I also worry about a bunch of things around UPI, which is the richness and complexity of doing financial services. Um, there has been a very high focus in UPI on the basics of moving some money and moving some information. And in that sense, it works, and it's where I call it a science project. But to do real world finance is actually extremely complicated. In real world finance, you have layers and layers of complexity. And I want to say this in a couple of ways. There is a problem that I can see, which is the problem of consumer support and addressing consumer complaints. There is no 1-800 number where you can raise an alarm about something that has gone wrong in UPI. Because NPCI says, who me? Go to your bank. Okay, and the bank say, who me? This is a UPI problem. Okay, so consumers are left running around and they actually don't know how to solve this. And for a compare and contrast, the card companies solve this. That there is a mechanism for us around MasterCard and Visa where we are able to find the correct throat to catch, and all of us know what is the right mechanism. If you want to dispute a charge on your bank statement for the credit card, you will call the bank, and there is a whole set of rules around which problems get solved. So this is the first aspect, that the technology was put up, but the complexities of engaging with consumers, I feel this was not adequately thought through. And this leads me to problem number 2, which is the difficulties of fraud in a UPI environment. Every system contains fraud. So I don't want to single out UPI for it, but I do want to observe that there's really a lack of richness and maturity in thinking through the anti-fraud procedures and complexities of the UPI system. In the rest of the world, we see enormous sophistication and complexity owing to the slow, organic, long-term evolution of financial products and systems. And also this connects to Indian socialism. In Indian socialism, the government tells you what anti-fraud systems you have to use. This is not how advanced economies work. Advanced economies work on legal principles that if XYZ harm takes place, the provider is on the hook. After that, the provider has to figure out what are the right technologies of anti-fraud. So what algorithms and procedures will be used to do anti-fraud is the business of financial firms and not of governments. In India, governments tell you everything. So the government says there's got to be an OTP for every transaction. Whereas in advanced economies, what you would get is the sophistication of saying, you are responsible if something goes wrong. After that, you choose what you want to do. And as an example, there are many coffee shops who will say, I'll take a card, and if it's a small value transaction, I'm just going to make the coffee without doing any other steps of security because it's a small enough transaction. If there are any concerns or allegations of fraud, I'll just reverse the transaction. I'll take a little loss because I'm making the business decision of how many seconds I want to waste at the counter versus the materiality of the activity. But India is a socialist country. The government tells you everything. So the government controls every little detail of the anti-fraud. And really, there's not a whole lot of anti-fraud in the case of UPI. So these kinds of problems have come together. My third and biggest concern about these systems, and in my opinion, that's the biggest thing that we need to worry about, this wave of the emergence of important, powerful computer systems in India, is the richness and the complexity of use cases and the diversity of the country. And again, let me start from financial inclusion, but actually this metaphor is general and it goes to health, it goes to everything. India is wildly diverse. The economist Land Pritchett used to always say to me that by many metrics, the best parts of India divided by the worst parts of India is more unequal than the best parts of Latin America divided by the worst parts of Africa. That's how diverse India is. India has more languages than the European Union. Okay, so we've got 3.3 million square kilometers of a highly diverse country, a country that should, in all fairness, be considered a subcontinent. And that makes you think that the people are different, their social and economic contexts are different. So, as wearing the mind of a private person, you want many, many different solutions. You want a process of discovery, not design, where many, many private people will compete and figure out the solutions that meet the needs of that diverse array of users. Okay, so my thumb rule is I consider every seven districts of India to be one little homogeneous region. This is an idea stolen from CMIE, which has a nice map where they have cut up India into about 100 pieces, and they argue that these are homogeneous pieces. So there are about 100 sub-regions of India which are sufficiently alike to be considered a homogeneous region and sufficiently unlike their neighbor to be considered distinct. So there are about 100 sub-regions in India, and in each of them there are four income quartiles with some of the world's highest inequality of income. And I'm not even going into other kinds of fractionalization that are present in the Indian economy. So there are hundreds of kinds of markets and people. And what we in India need is a market based process where firms think, innovate, compete, experiment, make mistakes, and discover the right metaphors and comfortable user experience and the business models, the user interface through which we can serve all these people. And my fear is that a process of design in the hands of a central planner will address a few rich people like you and me. It will address ideally some model user, but it will not meet the needs of the country because the country is wildly diverse. So this is my most complex understanding of why what India needs is a process of discovery, not design. That we need to free up the foundations of competition in many, many markets, and then there will be a process of discovery, and the end results will surprise us. That what is a good payment system? I don't think anybody knows the answer, and I don't think that there should be any top-down imposition of what is the correct way in which payments should get done all over the country.
Well, so there's a lot you said in there, Ajay, and you referred earlier to Nandan Nilekani, and who's the architect of the Aadhaar system. What would his take be on this, right? So where would he agree with you, and where would he tend to sort of part ways with your thinking? Because there's several strands to what you've talked about. One of them, I think, implicitly is that this sort of notion of sort of state capacity that and sort of we've discussed this privately as well, that you feel that India is an example of a state, one that lacks state capacity, and therefore is sort of susceptible to this coercion creep, right? Relative to, let's say, a state where there's more of a balance of power between the state and society. And I'm sort of borrowing from James Robinson's ideas in his co-authored book, The Narrow Corridor. Is that sort of what you're getting at? That your discomfort isn't really with the technology itself or the intentions, but with the fact that it's sort of being controlled by by the state that doesn't really have adequate legitimacy in your eyes to be sort of an actor that's controlling this technology.
So Nandan is a great guy. He has approached this as a technologist, and he takes a pragmatic view saying, look, we got to get things done. Okay. So he would say that these are long-term complex projects of fixing the financial regulatory apparatus, and uh, would the introduction of these technologies help? Would it make some amount of progress? Okay. And he would take the pragmatic view that here and now we will make progress by doing these technologies, and somebody else has got to figure out the rest. For example, in the case of Aadhaar, Nandan has always been fully on board on the idea that you need strong privacy protections. But then he would also say that's not my job, that that you need other energies in the system who would dream and build protections for individuals. And each one chooses their own specializations of what they want to play. And as I said, I was a happy and enthusiastic supporter of the Aadhaar system as long as it was viewed as an electronification of welfare payments by the government. And it was always expected and understood at that time. I'm discussing probably 2007, 2008, when these early conceptual discussions were taking place. It was always expected and understood that good privacy protections would also happen. And what's disappointing is that we're standing here in 2023 and there are no privacy protections. So I think that, it's also been my learning that I've gone away from being a technologist into thinking more about the overall working of the Indian economy and understanding these limitations. So can I talk a bit about fintech and the fintech revolution? Because I know
Yes.
it's very
Yeah,
close
yeah,
to your
yeah.
interest. So I just want to say, me too. Okay, I loved the idea of the fintech revolution when it first came about. But over the years, I've understood that actually you get very little fintech done in India because there is a financial regulatory apparatus which views the world in a central planning way, and that the central planners like to have the banks in place. So the heart and soul of a slogan of fintech was that to take pieces of what banks do and reimagine them in non-bank ways. Well, there's not an iota of that in India. Everything that happens in the banks, on the balance sheet of banks, and a variety of technology service providers spring up around the banks to support the banks. This is the central planner's vision that no, we don't like to question or challenge banks in any form. So what we are fine with is a couple of technology companies will come up. So you will see a PayPal or a PhonePe. These are technology service providers who will ride off the banks. The money will sit with banks. Banks will always be the core engine of Indian finance. These have been the decisions of the central planners. And so the give that is available for a fintech revolution to play out in India is precisely zero. And so, as a financial economist, as a financial economic policy thinker, I think the future of Indian finance lies in the problems of how to reimagine regulation, how to reimagine state power as it is applied to financial regulation, to the questions of consumer protection, microprudential regulation, resolution of financial firms, systemic risk. This is the biggie. The use of some computers by some banks and by some service providers to banks, doesn't seem like an interesting or important question to me. So I don't think UPI made a big difference to the difficulties of Indian finance. At heart, Indian finance does poorly on the problems of time and risk, and fixing the plumbing of payments partially didn't solve that. So the future of Indian finance is not in a little bit of better plumbing. The future of Indian finance lies in regulatory reforms, in creating checks and balances, in creating the machinery of the foundations of financial regulation to be done better. And in that, I don't see technology as playing an important role. It never hurts, but it's not an important thing. It's a relatively minor puzzle.
Coming back to sort of what I was saying earlier, it's like it seems to be that the technology has been sort of thought through reasonably well. I was reading that in 2019, one of Google's VPs for public policy sort of urged the Fed to follow India's example, which apparently has sort of also motivated or catalyzed sort of the development of Fed now in the US. The thing one hears is that this system must have been designed right, for it to be considered something that's exportable. But what seems to be the problem around it is the processes, right? What you're talking
there's
about, the
no. So let
coercive
me talk
aspect.
about UID AI because I know it a bit more than UPI, but I'm sure this is true about UPI as well. There's no question that there's good engineering there. Okay, so as I said, I happen to know the early design debates around UID AI. These are beautiful, well-defined design systems, but these systems fall into the context of a society and they reach out and have effects upon the society, and I worry about those things. So they fall into a larger context, and each country is in a different place and they can or will have impacts that are different depending on where you go. For instance, the PIX system in Brazil has been much more sparing in their use of coercion and the extent to which government has tried to turn this into a national champion. It's a pretty good system. So I'm not trying to take away anything from the engineering coolness that went into UID, AI, and some of these other systems. But what was also needed was a public policy framework where there was common sense and clarity around what is the role of the state, what are the difficulties of industrial policy, what goes wrong when you have national champions, why did Air India fail? It is not because there were bad managers in Air India, but because the very concept of having a national champion is problematic, about the need to nurture openness and competition, about the need, as Tagore would have said, the need to always have the winds from the whole world blowing into my house, to have foreign ideas and technology and companies coming into the country, competing. Okay, so uh, to set up a national champion as a payment system, you'd have to believe that now and forever, I will always have the best technology. And that makes me nervous. Maybe there'll be great ideas that other people will have. We should always be an open system. Let more energies come in and play and compete and participate. And out of that, you'll get better things as a consequence.
So, Ajay, what I hear you saying is that we lack a coherent public policy framework around these technologies. So, where does one start? By defining what a real public good should look like in these areas, like in finance and healthcare?
Yeah. So, I have a couple of elements that help us to grapple with these ideas. The first is that we should be cautious around technological solutionism. Technological solutionism. There are huge basic problems of law and regulation and the working of the state in poor countries. And, you don't get a whole lot by sprinkling powerful technology on top of these things. So, as an example, in finance, I have spent a large part of my life on figuring out these pieces. And as I say, the future of Indian finance lies in establishing the proper working of regulators with checks and balances, with clarity of mandate, and with the machinery to develop high quality regulations and to get out of this central planning and non-rule of law. So similarly in health policy, okay, the least useful end from which you can approach the difficulties of Indian health is technology. I mean, yeah, there is a little technology you can sprinkle around, but the future of health in India lies in solving the basics of establishing public goods in health and reducing the burden of disease upon the people of India. And technology is a part of that, but is really a sideshow. And to make an analogy, if you were doing a big business model transformation of the firm, primarily it's a business model transformation of the firm. And yeah, of course, we'll use plenty of computers everywhere, but you can't say that the computers are of essence in reimagining the organization. The next thing I'd like to say is that we should think about the narrow corridor, that the balance of power between the state and the people could tilt in one direction if we get a great escalation of state legibility, of the ability of the state to see the people. Under a fragile political system, this could take us off that difficult journey on the narrow corridor into the wrong place. So I feel that we should recognize that these technologies have major consequences. And I want to say this in two ways. One way is just the state harvesting data, and the other is the state pushing people into the panopticon. So, state coercion that forces people to interact with each other in the panopticon so that there is complete legibility. So, I think these things reshape the society in fundamental ways, and we should be concerned about these unintended consequences. And we need more.
So, how much of this sort of, because you talked about harvesting data and the ability of the state to do that and the lack of any sort of laws around protection of data, in the larger scheme of things, is that on the critical path, right? That there are no data protection laws. So in principle, the government can go and observe anything they want to because there are no laws against it, right? So is that sort of the most pressing thing, is to come up with data protection laws?
Sure. Yeah. So if you really had to have two big headlines, one is how to protect the data of the people. And please note, the word data protection law in India is an Orwellian law. It's about protecting your data from private firms, but governments get a free pass. So there's an exemption whereby governments can do anything, but private firms can be hauled up by the government on what they do with the data. So it's actually about enhancing state power, and it's not about protecting the individual. But that's what is called data protection in India. So again, you need to be.
And to what extent sort of does sort of evil big tech play into that thinking, right? Because in the US, the sort of narrative that's played out is that we've sort of left it to the private sector, and these people have just harvested huge amounts of private data and amassed great power, and that's not great either, right? So to what extent is that playing into this narrative?
So I'd like to say two things that the Western environment of data protection, which has really evolved through common law through all these years, has created extremely good protections against state power. For example, the FBI asked Apple to unlock a phone and Apple refused. And that's unthinkable in India. There is no way any private firm would have the nerve to push back against the government. And the second is, even when there is private data, there are checks and balances, which have again emerged from centuries of common law, which have created protection against what the corporations do. The second thing I'd like to say is that if push comes to shove, if I'm told that Google has an unreasonable amount of information about me and has the ability to use it as they like, I'm still fundamentally safe vis-a-vis Google because Google does not exercise coercive power. Whereas the state, Max Weber's definition of the state, is a community that establishes and maintains a monopoly of coercive power in a given territory. When data is in the hands of the government, it's a far more dangerous proposition as compared to data in the hands of a private corporation. So the abuses of data in the hands of private people is about selling me toothpaste. The abuses of data in the hands of a government is about taking a country on the wrong track in the narrow corridor. So they're different levels altogether. And I think that too many people in India have inappropriately read blog articles and the New York Times and have assimilated a Western conception of the big tech problem and have applied it into the Indian context. And that's, a poor reading of the political science that needs to be applied into India. In India, the journey is of basics. We've got to achieve freedom for the people vis-a-vis state power. So what we need is checks and balances about the state.
It's interesting because we both talked about James Robinson and Darren Asamoglu's narrow corridor and the sort of balance of power. So he talks about sort of the shackled Leviathan, right? That Europe and North America actually managed to sort of simultaneously increase state capacity and the capacity of society by deliberately sort of shackling themselves, and sort of taking certain powers away from themselves, right? I mean, that's sort of notion of a shackled Leviathan, and it almost seems to me
that is precisely where I am.
Yeah,
that's precisely where I am.
That the Indian state needs to sort of shackle itself and say, all right, that we're just not going to go and look at data, for any purpose whatsoever, except maybe some, egregious sort of national security threat, but not something that's exercised, on a daily basis, right? So that's
I mean, the FBI demanded data out of Apple in what was objectively a terrorist situation, and the greatness of the United States is that Apple could say no.
Right. So where I was going with this is that, even the US really lacks data protection laws, right? But, or they're a patchwork of laws.
Yeah, it's well developed out of common law. We should not underestimate hundreds of years of common law, which established doctrines and jurisprudence. So you don't need one single piece of law, which is called data protection law. What you need is a large number of cases where certain fair play and protections are established.
Right. So you sort of have the confidence that you can take it to the courts, right, and it'll be dealt with. But whereas I think in India, even the court system is kind of messed up, and really sort of strained to the limits. So even though there is an independent sort of legal system, it's sort of oftentimes sort of non-functioning.
That's a separate battle, but at least first on paper in the law, we need those protections. And today we are emphatically in a place where there are no limits on state power. In terms of surveillance and use of data, there are no limits to state power in the working of the financial regulators. They can go after individual people, they can do any amount of central planning, they can micromanage products and processes, they can exercise discretion that WhatsApp does not get this access, that PayPal is not allowed to do this, that Vodafone is not allowed to do this, and so on. So we are starting from one corner of state on top. And I think that's an unhealthy place to be. And then in that environment, when you introduce all this technology, it will have unintended consequences. So it's not an unvarnished blessing. And we need to think more about its impacts on society. And this is taking nothing away from the achievements of the engineers. But the thing is, we've got to think about the impact of these systems upon society.
So, Ajay, the broader question all this brings up is, to me, is that India has now a new and improved image in the world as a fast growing, tech driven liberal democracy. So, is this image getting ahead of the reality, which seems to be that it's a large central planning welfare state with a sliver of innovation thrown on top of that?
There are tides in the affairs of men. We watched with China, it was an overdone expectation that miraculously China was going to solve all its political problems and become a lovely democracy, that it would become an advanced democratic economy. And that didn't work out. And with a lag, the world understood that these political systems are a very big impediment. So I think of India as on the journey of middle income. We are at lower middle income. We have a lot of work to do. There are some foundations in India that are absolutely wonderful. There is more decency and less cruelty by the Indian state when compared with many, many other poor countries. And, I'm proud of being a part of this country in this environment where there is more decency, more freedom, and more fair play than many other horrible authoritarian countries. But by no means does that mean that we're finished on the journey of becoming a prosperous, liberal, advanced economy. So we're a very big country, we're a very powerful country, but we have real problems. We need to learn how to be a democracy. We need to learn how to host a market economy. There is very little understanding or commitment to the political freedom and the economic freedom that is required to be host to a sophisticated, affluent, mature society that can unleash the creativity of its people.
Well said, Ajay. Just want to sort of come back to something you referred to earlier, about sort of the role of technology in enhancing healthcare. I know that you've been, I guess, talking about longevity, right? That humans are likely to live a lot longer in the next few decades. So, what are the implications of that?
For humans in general or for India health?
Both.
For humans in general, I'm in the same boat as all of us. We are all trying to grapple with this world that is emerging in front of us. I think that our traditional cultural mores around the concept of old age need to change dramatically. So, we had this idea that we will live a certain life, and in the 50s and 60s we're supposed to slow down, and in 70s and the 80s we're supposed to get ready to meet our maker. And those numbers are all wrong, and we need to rescale ourselves in every way, that there are opportunities for reinvention. We can start a new life, and we can make long-term plans, that we don't have a 10-year horizon, we have a 50-year horizon. We should make long-term plans. I was describing a set of books that I have in mind. There are 4 books that I'm dreaming about where they will achieve the quality of my dreams only at the 3rd edition. So at the 3rd edition, there will be 4 books that I will be proud of. And it's a journey that I estimate will take me 20 years. Okay. Now, look, I'm 57. Do I have the right to dream these kinds of things? And I think the answer is yes, because of the bounty that medical technology and science is going to give all of us, that I can plan that 5 years from now, I will start on a 20-year journey of writing a set of 4 books, which I will need to rev 2 times to make them perfect. So I think our ambition around life and life design and the kind of time horizons that we play on needs to change greatly. For India, I have a bit of a narrow view. I think that in a lot of advanced economies, there is going to be a tremendous crisis of labor intensive healthcare. I think that we really need to think of a great deal of a transportation model
What do you mean by that?
and
What do you mean by labor-intensive healthcare?
Stigler's cost disease. A lot of personal care and healthcare is labor intensive. It takes people. You can't mechanize it. So, you need a nurse. You need a person who will help you to get a bath. So, this is personal support and healthcare services of nurses and doctors, but much more broadly, assisted living is a very big issue. And given the demographic structure of many prosperous countries today, there will be huge barriers in doing that. Just like there was an IT revolution and we found a way to connect a workforce in India to the needs of the global economy. I think that there is a comparable set of possibilities there through telemedicine, through what is called medical tourism, where people fly to India and get a knee surgery, and through assisted living in the nice weather of India. So I think these three phenomena can be just absolutely huge. We could be talking 100 million people living in India, traveling to India around these kinds of arrangements. So this combination of telemedicine, medical doctors, medical tourism, and assisted living in India. And there could be various bundles that put this together. I think a lot of Western government supported healthcare systems will be increasingly bankrupt. And this will become one pathway through which financial viability could be found.
Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, actually, that's becoming visible already, isn't it? I mean, you see sort of this increase in medical tourism. So, no conversation these days would be complete without some talk of AI.
I just got back from Goa where I attended a conference on AI for 2.5 days. So, I'm all juiced and charged on the subject of AI.
So what are your thoughts? Right? And I ask this, only because I've been sort of immersed in this field sort of ever since I was a kid, and so what's happening now is I find nothing short of unbelievable, right? Because for most of my career, no one cared about AI and no one knew about it. And suddenly it's like the biggest thing. And, people sometimes ask me, do you think it's hyped? And, my response is yes, definitely. And, do you think it's real? Yes, definitely. Like everything, right? So how do you feel about it?
So a couple of things. Like you, I'm an old timer. In the late 80s, my good friend M. Ganesh and I wrote a paper on using neural networks to predict credit ratings or credit default or something. So, like in the late 80s, I was writing code with neural networks. So I've been around this field for a very long time. As an old timer, I worry a lot about words. So just like I police the use of the word public good, like that I police the use of the word artificial intelligence. My good friend Amit Verma and I have a weekly YouTube show which is called Everything is Everything. And episode 2 is a rousing conflict between the two of us around the question, is this AI? Okay, and I play the role of a irritating conservative guy saying that these are very useful systems, but they are not artificial intelligence. They have no purpose, they have no creativity. And I'm an old fashioned person that any simple C program does not create intelligence. That said, these are very useful systems and a lot of good things will be done. I think a lot about India. I think about a lot about how these things will play out. And I see many, many different stories all across the Indian landscape. So let me sketch a few. Systems like GitHub Copilot assist a programmer to write some code quickly. It is sort of like looking at Stack Overflow and Stack Exchange and getting the scaffolding of something quick and dirty quickly. So it seems to me that that's something that Indian software companies could use. Indian software companies are plagued by labor shortages and they have large volumes of extremely low capability people who at first write wrong code. And then they figured out the processes through which that code gets refined by later stages and gets fixed up and turns into high quality code. So it seems to me that a lot of the processes of these Indian software companies could be improved, whereby at the weaker stages, those individuals could become more productive, but continue to write bad code because I have no illusions that, you know, assisted code that is written by ChatGPT is pretty horrible code. It does not remotely match the capability of a human mind, but it can increase productivity of a multi-person journey where you have some masters and you have some weak people, and those weak people become stronger. So I think in many of those kinds of applications, it'll help. There are truly dangerous applications. So for example, all over India, there are people who speak bad English, but English is the lingua franca of India. English is the most important language connecting all educated people in the country. And there are many people who speak bad English, who write English poorly. And these are people who are getting used to feeding a few badly crafted sentences into ChatGPT and asking him to compose a careful 500-word email. Now, those emails often have nuance which was unintended. And a person who doesn't know English well does not understand that what's being said is read between the lines in the hands of a native speaker to mean something that was not intended. But that person doesn't have the ability to debug that code. So, in a computer context, you can have a junior person writing some stuff and somebody else fixing it up. But here, when it's a personal tool which you think achieves grammatically correct English, it can actually be quite damaging because it conveys the wrong idea. So I think we need to think a lot about these effects as these tools pervade through society. I don't worry about job loss. I don't worry about some AGI taking over the world. I think these are solvable problems. So we should go further and understand this. I worry a lot about the extent to which ChatGPT is trained on a global internet and will lack Indian nuance on answers that are more social sciences and humanities. ChatGPT reflects some kind of average of what's written on the internet. And as I said, I was in a conference where a lot of these things were being discussed. And there are so many local questions. There's so much local knowledge in a country. And when people just use a tool like ChatGPT, it's like using a Google search, but we have a little more critical thinking when we use Google search. So imagine on page 4 of Google search, if there is a website in Orissa that has written something about it, we instinctively know that I'll pay more attention to that, and it's more likely to give me nuggets of local knowledge.
So why aren't you concerned about job loss? Just before I lose that part of the thread, there's two things you were talking about, like job loss, and actually the other thing that I was thinking about was inequality. Do you worry about? So you said you don't worry about job loss. I'm curious why. Do you worry about inequality, that it might actually exacerbate inequality?
Yeah. On job loss, the bulk of India does not operate under the rubric of the formal sector labor law. It's a classical labor market, so supply and demand clears to make a price, and there is high flexibility in the labor market. The export-oriented IT and IT-enabled services fields, we have seen huge technological transformations since the mid-90s when this field first became large and important. So that it's a way of life that the firms keep reinventing themselves, the employees, the individuals keep reinventing themselves, and I'm optimistic. So we don't have the frictions of trade unions and social security and government-run welfare programs, job protections. These are all the sources of problems. So as long as you run in a fairly market-oriented way, you get great industries coming and going and people reinventing themselves, saying, I used to be a call center operator, now I am an insurance claims processor, now I'm plugged into a new process design where in the back end LLMs are being employed. So I think India is in a good place on the bulk of the labor market, being a very flexible, classical labor market under conditions of hire and fire. So I don't worry about job loss. Meaning, yeah, there will be frictional transitions. Some individuals will get sacked, some companies will close down, some entire industries will close down. But the world market is infinite and there is a lot to do, and Indian companies will figure out what to do. So there will be plenty of jobs that are created along the way. On inequality, yeah, it could well be that inequality will go up. But overall, I think Indian prosperity will go up and aggregate GDP will go up, per capita GDP will go up, which for me is the prime purpose. I think, the number one priority for India is we need to become a richer country. I wouldn't worry if inequality goes up or down, because finally rich people spend money and that money gets around. So I worry more about aggregate GDP, and there should be more GDP in the country, and I don't worry about distributional stuff.
Yeah, it's like my friend Paul Sheard, who's an economist, says that I guess inequality is a feature, not a bug, of the market economy. I guess that's one way to look at it. That markets don't solve inequality, they create wealth. And sort of that's where you're coming from.
And that's the number one problem in
Yeah.
India, that we got to get rich.
Ajay, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thanks so much. I learned a lot. I really enjoyed myself, both just chatting to you and in preparing and thinking about this conversation. So thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Vasant. It is my honor and privilege to speak with you like this.